How do you react when someone you don't know very well strikes up a conversation about your diabetes? Maybe it's a stranger at the gym or a random person at the grocery store who spots your CGM. Sometimes I don't feel up to the task of explaining it all. Is that just me? My name is Scott Johnson, and I've lived with type 1 diabetes for 45 years. And today we're going to talk about some ways to handle those diabetes questions that catch you off guard. I'm here with Anna Sabino. She's a master's level social worker and a certified diabetes care and education specialist who's also lived with type 1 for over 30 years. She's going to help us handle this tricky topic today. Anna, thanks so much for taking time with me today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's great to see you.
Likewise. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey with type 1 diabetes for those who may not already know you? When were you diagnosed? What was going on in your life at that time? That type of thing.
Oh, how much time do you have?
Right.
My name is Anna Sabino. I am coming up on my diversary. This time of year is always a little extra special in terms of the transition to a new year. My diversary is January 15th. It will be 37 years for me. Wow. And I was in kindergarten. I was 6 years old, a pretty sort of traditional DKA admission, 6 days ICU near coma experience back in 1989. And I don't really have a lot of core memories without it. We certainly have come a long way, and diabetes has always been a very prominent part of my life for better or worse, but for the most part, better.
Yeah, I think we were diagnosed around the same age. I was 5 years old, and likewise, I don't have many memories from back then, but what are some of your first memories of diabetes?
Ooh, well, I have one, being in the hospital, I didn't know what was coming, but I remember there was a crib in my hospital room. I remember hiding under a crib. I had probably been inpatient maybe 48 hours, and I didn't want to have my shot. Yeah. And I think that was one of my first memories of feeling like I don't like this and this hurts and I don't want to have to do this anymore. And I will never forget that feeling of hiding and wanting this to not be visible and having people come find me and feeling like I didn't have a choice in this new part of me. And then, of course, the rest is history. But as a 6-year-old, that was one of my first kind of memories of living with diabetes while in the hospital and kind of starting to process it all.
Yeah. I mean, I think we often just take for granted how not normal it is to be stabbed with sharp metal objects and bleed on things. Like it's not normal, and it's totally normal for a young child to be mad and afraid of that. So that makes sense. What about getting involved with diabetes professionally? I
was one of these people who tried really hard not to let diabetes take over my world, professionally. I had taken a couple of classes in high school, like health and community health and AP psychology, and I truly feel like attending, diabetes camp as a counselor, and then I just sort of worked my way through the leadership totem pole. I knew that I wanted to be involved in the diabetes world in, some way, shape, or form. And then I decided to get a master's in social work, knowing there were so many broad options professionally in terms of the type of population and the type of setting. And I purposefully did not pick, my first year internship in the diabetes space because I was like, I need to explore all the things. Sure. Worked at a foster and adoption center, and I was just like, this is really interesting, but it didn't draw me in. And then I saw an ad for St. Louis Children's Hospital because I went to Washington University in St. Louis for my master's, and I was like, oh my gosh, this looks amazing. How can I make this work? Yeah. So I did some research actually on a type 2 study, and I was just drawn in. When you have a gut on something and you're like, yep, this is a good decision. I also knew that with my MSW, I could pursue the CDCES certification, and being able to combine both of those has just been a dream. And now I have created my own private practice and work with Gary Shiner, Integrated Diabetes Services, which is also just a huge honor.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And we're certainly grateful to have you in the world of helping people with their diabetes. What we're talking about today is that hidden weight of talking about diabetes in unexpected places and situations. And most of us don't struggle with what diabetes is. We struggle more with when, how, and whether we want to talk about it. So I'd love to spend some time today on what this actually looks like in real life.
Oh, yeah. And now my head is spinning because, when you think of the word diabetes, it's a whole language, right? We could write a dictionary and a glossary just on all the different terms that come with diabetes. I mean, that's why when we're diagnosed, especially in pediatrics, it's 2 or 3 days of, a crash course. Really, it should be a lot longer than that. That's a whole different topic. And for me, as I've realized really the last kind of 5 years, becoming a mom and trying to parent while living with diabetes, the biggest burden is this burden of self-advocacy. Because as an adult, we're always meeting new people on the train, traveling, at a child's soccer game, wherever it is, there's always an opportunity to introduce yourself. And at what part does diabetes become a part of that conversation? And how much do you expose yourself to the world? And I think it can be really challenging to try to slice and dice who you share what with and when.
Yeah.
There's no perfect recipe for how you do it. I think the easiest thing, the first step is always in any therapy, just like acknowledging that it sucks and acknowledging that there is this huge part of invisibility in diabetes that is there and that it is a burden. And the more we can talk about it, whether it is in therapy or in a support group setting or with the people that we know and trust, the easier it can usually be to allow those feelings to surface and start to expose yourself, outwardly and feel comfortable sharing bits and pieces of diabetes. And that's why there is so much anxiety and depression in mental health, because if we don't work on the grief part of it from the very beginning, and we don't process the feelings of what it's like to live with this from the very beginning, it's only going to get harder and harder the more often we suppress those thoughts and feelings from the get-go. For everyone, it's different. Everyone has a different journey. But to answer your question in this long-winded answer, there's always going to be this burden of self-advocacy. People are always going to ask questions. And how do you figure out who and when to tell is just a mental game for the rest of your life.
Well, and it's also, you touched on something I find interesting in that the process of dealing with the emotional side of diabetes. And that's something that I think for many of us didn't come along at diagnosis, right? Because at diagnosis, it's a complete fire drill of learning these critical skills. And it's almost like those outweigh, probably rightfully so for a while anyways, the emotional side of it. But for so many of us, the grief and emotional side doesn't get addressed until we reach some sort of crisis moment in that aspect of it, right?
100%. I mean, I don't necessarily know if I was diagnosed with sort of like postpartum anxiety, but as someone who was not diagnosed in adulthood, I felt like for me, becoming a mom for the first time was sort of like my diagnosis. I was in survival mode. I was trying to learn all of the things, but it took me 5 or 6 months to really process that my life has completely shifted. It took so much more effort to go to the grocery store. You got to change the diaper. You got to do all the things. Has she been fed? What was the last time? The extra thoughts that have to happen before you just get up and go is diabetes for the rest of our lives. And when you're diagnosed as a 6-year-old, you have usually a parent or two to be that with you, which is why I think I spend so much of my time in practice working with parents on that transition towards independence because it is such a, decade-long process. But from an adult perspective, sometimes that grievance and that sort of acceptance piece, for me, it came 6-7 months later after my daughter was born. And so many of us, most of the time when people come see any of us in private practice, they're not diagnosed 2 weeks ago. Right. From a therapeutic perspective, it's like a year later. Oh, we thought we had it all figured out. We, blah, blah, blah. 3 years in, okay, we finally decided that we need some behavioral help.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that we don't have an automatic behavioral validator along the bedside when we're diagnosed as, especially as an adult. So anyway.
No, it makes so much sense. It's interesting because I feel like I started to really wrestle with my emotional health around diabetes at a similar time in my life where, I was in my mid 20s and was just beginning to raise my own family. And that's where I started to realize no, I need some help with this. And it was actually a really challenging process to find resources while you're in the midst of that muck. I do feel like it is starting to turn a corner where there's more of people like you in the space making a difference and telling the stories there.
I would agree. And I think you can agree with me, Scott, that even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, diabetes wasn't talked about because there weren't as many decisions to be made. We didn't have the technology. It wasn't as visible. It wasn't honestly as a burden. I didn't feel a burden. When I was a child, my role was to understand what it felt like to be low and raise my hand and go to the nurse. And maybe get some icing or juice and get to miss class for 10 minutes. But I will tell you, I did not think about diabetes during the school day because I didn't take insulin and I wasn't allowed to. I took one shot at breakfast and one shot at dinner. And most people diagnosed and managing diabetes, up until the mid to late 90s, I know would agree.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The level of micromanagement today is much, much different than it was. And, thankfully, I think we're seeing the ability, at least, to manage blood sugars at a much safer place than we were 20 years ago. But there is a cost there. The other thing that comes to mind for me is, you described your childhood. And I think there's this sort of beautiful, ignorant resilience, right? It's like when I was young, I just wanted to do whatever I had to do with my diabetes so I could get back to playing with my Hot Wheels and G.I. Joes or whatever it was.
G.I. Joes, love it.
Time, right? And so there is that. But when we think about discussions now, right? I've had moments where I get into a discussion and I walk away thinking oh my God, why was that so draining? And I think part of it is sometimes those discussions come at us when it's not always in our control, right? Maybe somebody sees a device, a CGM or a pump site or something and asks questions where it wasn't up to me whether to start that conversation or not. Do you think there's something there? And do you hear about that from others?
There are always going to be people out there who are going to have questions. There's always going to be people who are curious, who want to help. And what I have, my word for this year is just intentions. And I truly believe that most people, I'm going to say most people in this world, have the best intentions when it comes to having conversations with us, whether it is a stranger on the street or, somebody at the gym that is just making small talk. I'm sure I have been on the other end of it, asking a question to somebody else and they're looking at me like I have 5 heads and, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
Diabetes is one of the most invisible illnesses out there, yet requires so much thought.
Yeah. But when we're entering in these conversations, whether it's in the community, whether it's with school, whether it's work,
we control our own destiny when it comes to how we respond. We can't control someone else's thoughts and what other people say to us. The only thing we can do is sort of decide how we respond back. And sometimes we do it out of spite and we're just like in rage mode and, we say things that maybe we regret later on. But going back to your thought about this built-in resilience, I think because we didn't grow up with all this technology, I have this mental ability to wait without the CGM, to trust that the food is going to bring my blood sugar up, and to be calm, cool, and collective when I speak to adults, because I just know that they have no clue.
And let's dig in on those feelings a little bit, right? So I think it's actually, we are kind of strange in that we have a community of people that around us with type 1.
It's a weird cult, Scott. You can call it that.
I know.
The cult no one wants to be in.
The cult no one wants, the club no one wanted to join. But I think a lot of people listening maybe are feeling pretty alone with their diabetes. And maybe a good place for us to start is sort of validating some of the feelings they might experience and labeling some of those feelings that they experience when they encounter one of these conversations that maybe didn't go the way they wanted to, or they felt a certain way about it. Yep. What are some of the feelings that people might experience there?
I mean, I think one of the first ones that we could probably all relate to is someone making that very well-known comment, "Oh, is that an insulin pump? My grandfather has that." Or, "Oh, you have diabetes." It's like the assumption.
Yeah.
The assumption piece of it. And this just comes down to basic communication skills. And I think another feeling we can all relate to is just fear. We don't know how to react when, we put so much effort into trying our best. And when someone makes a comment that might mean that we might not be putting in the effort, that's what hits. That's what hurts. I think that's why there's so much anxiety around going to see our endocrinologist, because the data doesn't necessarily represent the effort. Right. And it's a lot easier to talk about quantitative data than it is qualitative, because it's easier to download. It's easier to analyze for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'll leave that there, because I think that second point is pretty heavy when we talk about the effort that it takes, and that effort isn't visible. That is where a lot of the shame and I think blame comes into the conversation that is internalized from people with type 1. And so that is why diabetes is so just relentless and demanding. And half the time, these numbers just are the way they are from like a biological perspective. And, it's not our job to figure out why every blood sugar shifts the way it does. That is just, it is impossible. And I think until we can accept that, it's really, really hard for people to feel confident in having these self-advocacy skills, which is why I'm such a huge proponent of mental health, because until we can process that, it's really hard to then feel confident explaining to other people. And other people are always going to have questions.
Yeah. Well, this is a great time to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we're going to start talking about some of those practical tools and what we can do to deal with these. So we'll be back in a second. One of our favorite things is sharing stories from people who've participated in the Blue Circle Health program. And I have one here from Helena in Ohio.
Hello, my name is Helena, and I was diagnosed in 2018. Since my type 1 diabetes diagnosis, I have struggled in a variety of areas, including grieving what life was like prior to my diagnosis at 18 years old, struggling to navigate the ways this change had impacted my identity, and uncertainty surrounding navigating insurance and medical care as a young adult. I initially chose to enroll in Blue Circle Health, seeking support from their insurance navigators, as I was frozen in fear when it came to navigating the terrifying world of health insurance and T1D. Little did I know I would gain so much more. Not only did I feel more confident understanding and navigating insurance, but also received mental health support related to my T1D that I hadn't even realized I needed, tips and tricks on managing my blood sugar effectively, resources to support myself and my other T1D family members, and endocrinology services that allowed my blood sugars to reach time and range I had never experienced before. Every member of my team was truly a blessing. I've never felt so cared for, seen, or supported in my T1D management journey. I've been telling every T1D I know about these services, and I'm so thankful I was able to discover the services at the time I needed them most. Thank you, Blue Circle.
Helena, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I also want to make sure everyone listening knows about the CWD Journey Award. And listen, there's no sponsorship here. This is not an ad. They don't even know I'm doing it. This is just me helping share some great programs from great organizations to all of you listening. The CWD Journey Award recognizes the work and resilience required to live with type 1 diabetes. You can request a Journey Award at no cost. They'll even cover shipping to U.S. addresses. You can learn more at childrenwithdiabetes.com and look for Journey Award in the navigation menu on the website. Welcome back. So we've talked about why these moments sometimes feel so hard, what we're feeling, and now I want to spend some time really focusing on what people with diabetes can actually do when they're put on the spot.
Absolutely. So first of all, you don't owe anyone anything when it comes to sharing your diabetes. I think there's a time and a place. You can write down in a journal or a notebook, an elevator speech. If you have a lot of social anxiety and have a hard time, with public speaking or just communicating with adults in general, and you just are a little bit more of an introvert, sometimes practicing on a partner or a loved one can be really helpful. I think therapy, again, I know I'm a huge proponent of it, is a great place to start because oftentimes it's a neutral way of getting everything out. And it's an opportunity to practice saying the wrong things. So when those conversations do arise or you are potentially caught off guard, you sort of already know what those feelings are and have already gotten them out and surfaced them. To the point where you may not have those like rage, FU type responses. You don't know what you're talking about. You also have full permission to say, thanks so much for your question. I'm really having a bad day and I don't want to talk about my diabetes today.
What do you tell people who worry that maybe these semi-prepared responses feel fake or rude, right? It's a balance. There's part of it that's like having them ready helps alleviate some of that stress, but then there's also the concern about how they're received.
Yeah, 100%. And like people are allowed to feel whatever they want to feel, right? Someone can say, oh, like, I really hate the dress you're wearing. Like they're allowed to say that. The only thing we can control is our reaction and what we say back. And so again, you can practice the role play. You can practice reading books like, oh, well, that was a really like annoying response. Like, what the heck? I wasn't expecting that to happen. And that's the I wasn't expecting that to happen sort of mantra is what I use a lot. Diabetes has a lot of ups and downs that we don't necessarily plan for, like a site ripping out on a doorknob or a blood sugar in the middle of a soccer game, whatever it is. You can't plan for that a lot of the time. Well, wasn't expecting that to happen today. And instead of being like, all of this sort of, physical rage that comes with it, take a step back. Wasn't expecting that to happen. Oh, well, if it becomes, like a 3-day pattern, sure, I'd make some, basal bolus adjustments. But on the general rule of thumb, oh, wow, wasn't expecting that to happen. And if you can find something else in your life that's not diabetes related that you can practice with in terms of that is like potentially like, you weren't expecting to get pulled over or like something with a red light or like you're running late. Those are usually more frequent that are relatable with other people that you can have those conversations with that can also just help your neural pathways like adjust to some of those like initial reactions that you may want to pull out of your head when you're in fight or flight mode.
It sounds like that, though, that using that example of, I wasn't expecting that, it's a useful reframing tool, right? That can help you just get some space between what's actually happening and the emotions that we're attaching to it, right?
Absolutely. And that's really, the mantra of like two things can be true.
Right.
Someone's allowed to, you can still feel annoyed that someone's saying something to you, and you don't have to respond, back with, hurtful comments.
Yeah. Where does self-compassion come into this, right? Because that's also part of the picture as well, isn't it?
Yeah, always. And self-compassion is something that takes time when it comes to diabetes. I mean, it is a huge lifelong healing journey when we have something like diabetes that has no end. I'm doing the best I can is something that I try to tell people to write down, like pen to paper. I'm doing the best I can. And maybe having this response, this like rage response, like, no, I don't need a granola bar. That's not helpful. Maybe that was your best response in that moment. Yeah. And that's okay. That's okay. I think the sort of red flags for concerns for me are usually when, others start to notice some of this, rage behavior or personality shifts, when there is a pretty big pattern of change in behavior or shift in behavior, and there's no other sort of explained reason why from like a medical perspective. It's so important to process all of your emotions early and often when it comes to diabetes, because the more you understand yourself, the easier it's going to be to talk about it outwardly.
When you talk about shared decision making, if I think about a scenario where maybe it's someone who's single, they're an adult living by themselves with type 1 diabetes, where might they turn, right? It's a different scenario dealing with a family or young children. Are you thinking like their healthcare team and finding community and others living with type 1? What comes to mind there?
Absolutely. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with social media. There are so many opportunities to join community groups and chats, and, Breakthrough T1D, your healthcare team should have a list of resources, both locally and nationally and online to work with you to find that community support. I will say they're only as helpful as you allow them to be, from an online support, perspective. I've seen a lot of challenging conversations online when it comes to diabetes. So I always just recommend proceed with caution. If you find that the online community support is not being a helpful tool for you, take a break. Yeah. Podcasts are great because it's audio, and you can process and highlight, take away the highlights in terms of the take home messages. Everybody who's listening to this is going to be like, oh, that was a total waste, or or have, something that really hit home for them, or not. I think some people are going to find support in reading books. Some people are going to find support in one-on-one therapy. Some people prefer group therapy. So I think it's knowing your own self, knowing your own identity, your personality type, and what does that look like when it comes to letting people in?
Yeah. And it's just another great example of how individual all of our diabetes is. As we start to kind of wrap up here, what are a handful of takeaways that you want to be sure someone thinks about as they leave this episode?
Yeah. I think, the first one is like, you are your own team captain of your diabetes ship. When it comes to sharing information, you are the captain of your own ship. You don't owe anyone anything when it comes to your own sort of self-advocacy. Number two, safety and progress over perfection. Right now, there's no finish line when it comes to diabetes. Continue to celebrate those little wins, and there will be ebbs and flows in your mental health, just like there are in, physical diabetes management with your time and range and A1C. And the more that you can get in touch with what are your triggers from a mental health perspective, how can you identify what is going to set you off? Is it a high blood sugar? For me, I know I'm like moody AF when my blood sugar is over 300, and my husband can tell. He's like, what's your blood sugar? And I'm like, oh, yeah. That. So really just be mindful of your, mental patterns as you're going out in the world. Like, oh, my blood sugar's high. Maybe I'm going to be a BITCH to the crossing guard if they don't let my kids cross the school and they're not late for their first class. So just being mindful of that. And then I think the third one is really just, don't wait to reach out for mental health support, because even as someone who has lived with it for 37 years, I struggle internally with my own burden of self-advocacy, and I do only wear my CGM on my arm. I do let my tubing of my T-Slim dingle dangle out. And even at the gym this morning, I'm like, oh, these are a bunch of new people. They didn't ask, but I wonder what they're thinking. I moved on. But the more I can talk about it in a neutral way, the more comfortable and confident and relaxed I'm going to feel. I know the next time I might encounter someone who might say something. It just allows you to take a deep breath and process it, where if you don't, the likelihood of you saying something that you may regret or not knowing how to process it, you don't want to process it with a stranger and take it down a rabbit hole that you do regret. Practice with a loved one or a friend, or in a coping strategy that you feel safe and comfortable doing.
Yeah, I love that. Is there anything that I haven't asked about that you think it's important for people to hear today?
I don't think so. I think, again, it's just, please don't be afraid to ask for mental health help. I really, truly believe that the stigma around mental health has shifted, and it should be a priority as part of a care team. And there are so many people out there who will meet you where you are from a financial perspective. And it doesn't have to be a social worker. It can be a coach. It can be a dietitian. It can be, mental health has however you perceive it. So as long as you have a relationship with someone that is going to boost you up from a mental health perspective as it relates to your diabetes, I'm happy.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you online if they want to connect more?
Yeah. So I have a website. I work with parents, kids, families, adults, young adults with type 1, findingsmilescoaching.com.
Thanks again. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Scott. Take care.
If you enjoyed this episode, think about leaving us a review and subscribing to the podcast. You can also check out the video version on the Blue Circle Health YouTube channel. And be sure to tune in for our next episode, where we're going to spend some time talking about exercise and activity with type 1 diabetes with Gary Shiner, exercise physiologist, author of one of my favorite books on diabetes, Think Like a Pancreas, and as Anna mentioned, the owner and founder of Integrated Diabetes Services. I hope you'll join us. Until then, keep living well with T1D.